Hey, good afternoon, everyone. As always, we'll give everyone a few minutes to get in here. I'm your humble moderator today, and again, as always, if you want to use you can type a question in the chat, a question in the QA section, or just use the raise hand feature, and we will call on you as if we're in school again. So give everyone just a minute here, and then kick off. All right, everyone, here we go. Let us know what questions you might have. Again, you can ask questions in the chat, use the raise hand feature, or ask a question in QA. Sabrina, do we have any pre-submitted tickets from today, or questions, excuse me?
We do not.
Okay.
Hey, Will, it's Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy, go ahead.
So, not really of a question of how to, but more of a best practice. So I've got a truth table that I've got like, say, 50 fields in. It's kind of difficult to build, 50 fields in a truth table.
Sure.
But it works. Would it be better to do that or build something like a flow structure and a fetch entity to run that? What's kind of the best practice of that?
Yeah, I always think if I have the choice, and it all depends on what the level of detail for the rule is. If I have the opportunity to not use a truth table and use like an entity that I fetch, then I'll always use the entity, the model there. In fact, I was working through this exact example with someone for this thing here. They've got this ask about being able to take a profile from Workday and then get a list of distribution groups to sort of automatically create the security group association in Active Directory for that Workday profile. And so decisions would sit in the middle there. Now, you can definitely use rules or truth tables to do that. But the question is, how complex is the logic? In this example, it's like it's very much just a couple string equals. If you want to find the role type, it's like role type, role function, location, some other just simple values. That request would come in and you could say, fetch me the thing which matches all of these criteria. And that's very easy to do without using a truth table. Okay, go ahead.
The one I'm doing is just two columns. It's pulling from another SQL database that I've exported to CSV.
Okay.
So I'm trying to find 5 equals a certain product type. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. It's the first time I've done a truth table, and it was kind of tedious building all of those into that truth table. And I was like, is that really the best route to go?
What's the relationship between all the columns in the truth table and the two columns in the thing you just mentioned?
So it's just two column out of another system, just a numeric value, and then the text value of what it is. So like 15 equals, a school issue, and I'm just doing a truth table that if the number is 15, then what does that value equal?
What's the value, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I would use an entity model for that all day. Absolutely. The biggest thing you get for that is when the value changes or you need to add a new value, you don't incur the cost of a code promotion. You just add another piece of data.
Yep.
That's the single biggest win there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about halfway through building it, but
yeah, the sort of middle ground there is to use an external data truth table, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with those. Those are kind of a bridge between the two. An external data truth table allows you to create a database table, or even you can use a CSV file, but you shouldn't. But like you can create a database table, and like so you'd have a flow. I'm sure that would import, or even just do it a single time, import these code to description values, whatever these things are, right? And and then you create that use a simple data structure or an entity, and then you go and use external truth table, and the rows of the truth table are the rows from the database table, and then you can do normal. You can't do every single rule function that you can in a normal truth table, but you can then build a truth table. In fact, let's see if we can't find a doc for it here. This is in version 6 and 7, external truth table here. But at the end of the day, what you get is a truth table whose data comes from a database table. So there's like normal truth table, which is not the easiest to maintain with lots of rows and lots of columns. There is just a pure like data structure model, which we were talking about, where I don't use logic at all. I just build a data type that has the right fields on it, and then I just have a flow fetch those things for me.
Yeah.
And then the external truth table might be a middle ground between the two.
As far as like it running in the process, is there any performance one over the other once you've got the truth table built?
That's a great question. At the end of the day, the rule engine is just the flow engine with a nice looking editor skin on it. And if you use entities, those things are cached. So there might be a difference here at if we get like if we're talking about millions of transactions, there could be like milliseconds of difference, but they're not going to be anything that would be I would say like we'd be talking about like significantly large data volumes for any performance difference to show up. And I'm not even sure which would be faster, honestly. I mean, if you think that you've got a couple hundred rows of entities cached in a flow whose job is to fetch them, I mean, there's no database activity there as long as the cache stays active. So it's very much data in, data out. Now, there would be no other object for the truth table, which so probably would be faster. But if I had to just guess, which I am, it'd be milliseconds. It'd be like indistinguishable from, as long as we're not talking about large data volume.
Nah, a couple thousand.
Yeah, there'd be no difference there.
Okay. And it's much easier on the data structure versus the truth table to maintain.
Yeah, from a maintenance side, it's night and day, right? Like you get a new code in, you don't edit that code in dev, promote it to test, and then promote it to prod. You just go in and you create yourself a management dashboard, right? And which is just a folder with a report, which is what I had up on the screen here, right? This is just a folder with a report, with a page on a report. You add some actions to add new ones. If it's an entity, you get the default CRUD actions to edit and delete them if you don't care about the UI that much. So you don't need to incur any cost in terms of designing the CRUD actions. And then you just have a flow that fetches them. And the nice thing too is if it doesn't find one, you can handle that in some sort of way. You have a no results path off your fetch entities, go to like a assignment that says new code type found or something. And so you can create some organic type of tasking behaviors there. But yeah, I always push everyone to that data-based model. It's just really just a lookup list, right? That's all we're really talking about.
Yep. Exactly.
Because a truth table becomes kind of overkill for that. Because you don't have any really complicated business logic there. It's just simple lookup stuff.
Yep. So. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thanks. That's one of my favorite ones to talk about. So. All right, so we got a question here from Scott. When we have a form that has many, many fields, what is the best way to add a new field in the middle of the form without clicking and dragging each object? All right, we have anyone from services team today? I don't know that there is a better way to do this without dragging things around. Which I don't enjoy saying. Let's see here. Let me create a folder. And create a form. So the question is, if I have a bunch of text boxes here, that suggestion text is going to get me in trouble one day, I'm sure. Yeah, all right, so the question here is, you have a form like this, Scott, and you want to be able to bring something in, like in line. Now, what version are you on right now?
6.
Okay, because you should be able to do, now there's probably some form, redo, don't get rid of that, there we go, whatever. You should be able to just, one of the things is in 6, you should be able to drag in on a normal grid and let it have the opportunity for you to drop it in, which you can see that what this is doing.
Okay.
I don't know if this was in vanilla 6 or if this showed up in 6 at some point.
Okay.
I'm unsure which, but I'm currently on 6.13. I was troubleshooting an issue a customer's having. I'm on 6.13, so you can definitely do that on 6.13. Now, could be complications there given the complexity of like your nesting, because you can nest grids inside of grids and things of that nature. So there might be some complexities there that make that more difficult than this, but it should attempt to give you a new grid cell and allow you to drop that in.
Gotcha.
As I'm doing on the screen right now.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, any other questions I can answer for you now?
No, I mean, that gives me one thing. That gives me one thing to check into. I that would work for my purposes. I've got a fairly long list that is sort of built by user action, or not user actions, but it's defined by the business. So I may have things get added in as things get more complicated. So I didn't want to have to build forms, especially with a lot of inputs. Then I have to go around, just remove everything. But if that works, that will actually solve my problem. So I was trying to find some kind of insert row, or you move them down, and all of those things weren't doing exactly what I thought. But if I can drag them in and have them work, then that'd be fine.
Another option, which can get a little wonky, is you can add a row and move the rows around. So if I come here to and I add another, I'll add a static size row that's, like 40.
Okay.
So this is going to add at the bottom. Now you see I'm on this highlighted grid, and it's out on the bottom. And this shows me, if I click onto the grid, I can see the column and grid configuration. And then once you have that, you can select it and move it up and down. And you can move these things. Now, the contents can get a little wonky as you do this. They don't.
Yeah.
So you might have to move them around a bit after you've done that. It doesn't always
Gotcha.
play that nice
Right.
as it sort of moves the controls around, but that's an option for you as well.
Okay. Yep. I wasn't aware of that either. So, yeah, those are a couple of good things that.
And the last thing I'd mention is if we have a control called a user control. So if you find yourself creating similar sets of controls and you want to maintain those in a single place, we have a thing called a user control that can let you have groups of controls that are called by reference. And so if you have like a consistent header or some other part of a form, like an address type box or something with multiple fields, user controls will allow you to maintain those at the user control level, not at the form level. And so you can use the same user control over multiple forms and maintain those completely separately. That might be something to think about as well.
Yeah, something to look into. Okay. Because I can see why. So, because this particular form has, let's say, multiple sections in it, and within each of those sections, there'd be a way to subdivide the form into sort of more manageable chunks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that's something I'm thinking this might be useful for?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, you could absolutely do that. And you can have multiples of these things on one form. There's a single one, which is this easier to find, and then there's a multi one. So if you're finding yourself with like a data grid or some row-based report, one of our like a data grid that we have, and you don't enjoy the UI of it, you can build data repeaters, and those are user controls that show for lists of items. So you can control a list of like an accounts or a list of some other data object, and you build that each item in the list up in a form design experience, and then we render each item in the list as a data repeater row, and that way you can get much more fine UI control over how the data repeaters or how those rows show up on a form.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining. Happy to take these type of questions on.
Yep, you bet.
All right, we got a question from Daniel. What's the best way to have report columns dynamic based on results from SQL? As I can manually set the column width, but if not set when setting up a report, it just scrunches all together. I can describe over audio, I guess. Maybe I'm doing the report the wrong way. Can we make sure that these questions are getting copied into the chat, please, so people don't have, Sabrina? What's the best way to have report columns dynamic based on results? So the question, Daniel, is about the actual like format of the report column?
Yeah, exactly. So I have a stored procedure that I'm calling, and I'm pulling back about 50 different columns.
Mm-hmm.
And if the results coming back are longer than the standard width of 100, it just truncates it at 100. And the end users have to make those columns wider. Or I can manually set those widths and guess to the data coming back, and it'll hold. But ideally I have 4 or 5 different reports. I'd assume not have to set the width of each column manually if possible.
That's a great question. I mean, I don't think we can.
Okay.
I mean, arguably we should be able to. Anybody else join from my end? Let's just see. So the question here is, I'll just add accounts. And then I'm going to add a bunch of columns, right?
Yep, exactly. So it defaults all those to 100 width.
Right, exactly.
If it goes over the allotted space, right? So if you keep adding more and more rows, it scrunches more and more and more. So here it's actually, I believe the rows are getting expanded a little bit further. So if you only have one column, obviously it expands it to the width of the page.
Right.
But if you add 50 columns in there, you're just going to start getting less and less space. Now, if I define the rows, the widths of each one of those rows, then the user will see the report and be able to scroll on, the dashboard essentially when it opens up.
But your ask is actually be able to have a default width set or a dynamic width?
Dynamic. So for based on data coming back to be able to show all the data in there.
I see. So like a minimum width based on like content in the cell.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have that. as great as that would be. The containers in a lot of our UI, the containers really don't know the content they're being used to contain, even in our forms, right? Our forms don't grow and shrink really based on the content size. They'll just apply scroll, except for when you're using particular layouts to handle that. So I'm sad to say I don't have the ability to do this currently. Now, possibly we could do this with the SDK if this was a huge problem for you. But yeah, unfortunately, no, there's no easy win there.
Okay, and no other way to say display data. I have it doing that SQL query or the stored procedure to get the data back. Any other options there? Right now I have it on a web dashboard. I don't have them actually logging into decisions, but just going to a dashboard and clicking a link, and it pulls up the results of this page, right?
Okay.
So they can do filtering. Any other options there that might, be a little bit easier for the end users to manage it?
So are you using a page with a report viewer or just giving them direct access to the report?
Page with a report viewer. I'm trying to keep them out of the decisions portal and everything. Just kind of like a web UI is what I give them.
So we used to be able to give you, so grow field group name, default specified, editable, icon type circle, alternate row background, selected row, action. Enable grid stretch mode. I don't actually know what this does. It doesn't appear to be doing anything right now. Is it that we're not applying like a scroll bar at all?
So you get the scroll bar. Yeah, we get the scroll bar, but if you look at like the third field there, they have to expand that to see all the data. Excuse me.
Right.
So, I can hard code it right into the report when I build it. I was just thinking shortcuts. And if I hard code it to, 300 for the width of each field, essentially I have to go through the report and look at the data and really hard code, create a list on the side and then hard code all that in the widths. And then they'll get a scroll bar because obviously the widths will be much larger than the page.
Right. Yeah, I don't think there's anything on the report viewer that will give us a win here. I know we can't control this with CSS because it doesn't chain.
Yeah, I mean, the good part is if I hard code it once it sticks.
Right.
And then if a field isn't big enough, they can always expand it or whatever needs to happen there. But I was just shortcutting it.
Yeah, I don't think we have the ability to do this right now.
Right.
You have to. It is something you have to handle at design time, unfortunately.
All right, that's fair. Figured I'd ask.
This matrix. Yeah, thanks for asking. Sorry, I wish I got a better answer for you.
No, I mean that explains why I couldn't find it. The other, I did have another question on that.
Oh yeah,
report.
please.
If you go back to the data fields where you actually select the data fields, you can't move those around at all, correct? So if I add 5, you have all those and you want to add, row number 2, you want something else. How would you get, say moving that last all tags data up into row number 2?
Now this is different between 6 and 7. Which are you on right now?
We're on the latest 7. So
yeah, this one, I'm not a huge fan of this, and I'll just say that publicly, but you should have a little filter icon somewhere around this spot on your report designer.
Yes,
Click into that, and there will be a list of
there
columns, and you can move them up and down.
Move up and down. Perfect. That's what I needed.
You used to be able to drag and drop these. They pulled that out, and I couldn't disagree with that particular decision more. But you can move them. It's just not the easiest experience in the whole world.
You know what? That works out perfect because I have the ability.
Yeah. So
misclick and miss one, it's kind of tough to go, like, oh man, I got to delete half of them to add it back in.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So
Cool.
in 7, and I guess I just need to start having a 7x instance up whenever I'm doing these. I'll make a note for myself for that. But yeah, so you can move them. You can move them during that using that. I guess I should show that. Let me log in for those of you that are on 7. So the question that Danny was asking is rearranging rows, and in 7, it's different than it was in 6. So if I open up this and just add a bunch of rows here, it's this filter icon, and then I move the columns around using the columns control here, and it will then move the columns around on my behalf. Okay, anything else?
I think that's it for now.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Mhm.
All right, Alex, I got a question. I tried to add hi, join late. Blah, 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 blah. I tried to add fields by insert rows and columns in the grid layout, but in some cases I even lost existing fields and labels. Is there a preferred way to do that? The way I would recommend doing it is the safest way, and this can get a little squirrely, admittedly, as I was mentioning to Scott, is if I go back to my form, is to click into the grid, and this can be a pain. I mean, I prefer the advanced layout here, which is columns and rows, but shown in this easier text edit view.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would do is always start somewhere near the bottom, so you could add a new row, and then you'll see that row show up. And now that I have that row, I would march it to where I need it to be using the control. So I would select it here and move it up. And this is going to be the safest way to sort of get a new row somewhere into a grid and retain and not lose any of your content, because you can. Another way would be to just move the whole grid into another place, and then you could add another grid, set it up as you need, and then bring everything over once you have that. So you could kind of use, there's not really a scratch pad per se, but you could use, this isn't a good example. You could say, one of the things that I know the PS team does when they're in the middle of a big build is they might come here and they might add another column, right? And then with that column, they can keep the old one in. They can then design the new, grid here with the appropriate, and then just drag everything over and then delete this other. So kind of using the grids to kind of create like a temporary scratch pad so you can move your things around. I would recommend one of those two approaches if you're having issues.
Neither is very clean or easy to implement, but it's better than losing fields.
Yeah, when the form gets big enough that those aren't ideal, but that is what we have right now.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. All right. Chris has got a question. How many rows is too many rows for a data repeater? This is the question. I think 100 is too many, personally. Like, I don't actually know the answer to this, Chris. I mean, arguably, we should know what the sort of performance cost looks like as we add data repeater rows. I think of data repeaters as in the handful to few dozens, and not they're definitely not a replacement for a report, right? You shouldn't think about data repeaters as being able to replace reports. They don't have paging, right? The biggest thing is that they just don't have any concept of paging. They're going to load every record that you attempt to load, that you pass into that form. You'll see this sometimes where on importing things, the thing that can actually slow an import down the most is having a large set of import resolutions to display, because those all get loaded in data repeaters in current versions of the product. Yeah, I would say I think about these as like 20 to 40 max type counts, not like as a replacement for reports, because they don't have you can't search inside of them without adding in data flows and all sorts of things. You can't page them, and with those two things not existing, and we needed lots of data, I would look at some other. I'd probably just look at try to replace my form with a report if I was needing to do that.
Curious.
Yeah. What's are you using them more aggressively than that?
Well, I was compelled to use them more aggressively than that, and haven't had time to circle back and figure out just how bad is that consequence and why, and do we really have to do it this way? But I believe I have one. I want to track down if I can get try to get any metrics on it that may be trying to swallow as many as 10,000 records.
Yeah, I would not recommend that. Right? I mean, you just can't.
Yeah, it just seems like a really, really bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Every way you look at it. Unfortunately, it was hey, we got this, make it do this. And I only had 3 weeks, so not much time to negotiate with a very, very important customer, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of ended up in this odd spot, and I'm trying to size up just how much damage has this inflicted anyway.
I mean, if you already have that design in place, I'd recommend not passing that data repeater set in from the parent flow, but trying to use a data flow to implement some kind of artificial paging. So you could imagine like you have a data flow that there's a text box above your data repeater, right? And that text box acts as like a search string. And if it's empty, you just get the first 10 or 100 results, right? And you show those. But if a user searches it, the data flow runs and returns, so using some flow-based logic, the things to return. You just can't scroll through that many objects effectively. That's how I think about it. I wouldn't pass that many items into a drop-down list, much less a data repeater if I could avoid it. And let the loading of that content be on demand instead of have the form incur that cost each time. You can definitely do that with data flows. So like I've years ago for a customer, they were using our old data grid, and they had an enormous amount of records, and they needed paging, and so we basically used data flows and some trickery to create artificial paging where we would use some clever SQL to actually get row counts and order them and get get 1 through 100 and 101 through 200 and so on and so forth.
Well,
to avoid some of this.
In some ways, that's a two-part concern. One concern being that why do you expect this user interface control to load an arbitrary number of data rows and think you're going to get a good result out of that? I kind of do have some criticism of my user community for that expectation. I think maybe just the urgency of everything is why I haven't heard any feedback in terms of it being slow, even though I can't imagine it's good. In fact, slow problems seem to have more to do with reporting that we just talked about earlier, as opposed to this. The other thing that I got gives me a bit of a pause in terms of it's not every case, for example, that's going to have 10,000. It's actually a small minority, as best as I can tell. But it also gives me a bit of a pause that in order for this form to try to show you 10,000 rows in a data repeater, which I think is a mistake, I also have a flow that's carting around 10,000 rows of entity records. Which strikes me as, well, is that really a good use of memory? What are you doing there?
Mm-hmm.
That's the other pause that I have about that.
Yeah, exactly. All good concerns. I would just say in general, don't use data repeaters as replacements for reports. And if you somehow have to pass in thousands of rows, load those things after sort of on demand instead of at form load, at initial load, would be my mitigating best practice recommendations.
Right. For what it's worth, I think one of the problems I'm bumping into is that we have so the reason, an important reason why we have decisions is because we have so many business processes that are basically implemented by convention of an email sequence where we're passing around Excel spreadsheets. And I believe I have users who really try to fit everything into the context of I want a spreadsheet but smart, which I think is how we get ourselves in these strange corners where we're thinking about this as basically a direct replacement for a spreadsheet with all of the fancy data entry things that spreadsheets support, including outrageous amounts of data because it's all on your desktop anyway.
Can you restate the question for me there?
Well, I mean, the question was how much is too much for a data repeater, and knowing that I'm surely over that line, but didn't know if we had any good guidance on it. And a reason why I think data repeaters emerged in this kind of abuse is because it's the best way to try and pretend that what I have here is just like your old spreadsheet, but smarter.
Have you tried a CSV editor control to see if that meets your need?
I have not.
We have a CSV editor control that can add columns, allow you to interact with the cells, add rows, add columns, things like that. You pass a CSV in, it passes a CSV out, and you can interact with it. I'd recommend exploring that a bit and seeing. You don't have as much control over the UI with a data repeater, of course, but it is meant to handle, modifying Excel files as they pass through a form.
Does it have any? So this is a control then that would be on the form?
Yeah, it's I think CSV editor is the name. Yeah, CSV editor.
And we're in 6.
Yep. This is an old control. So if we were to run this form in our flow, I could give you an idea about what it looks like on my terribly ugly form. I wasn't supposed to do that. That was dumb. Actually, I'll use that form. That'll be easier to see. CSV editor and a button. Debug this. Let me pass this. Does it want a file? Yes, it wants a file. All right, let me find a CSV file.
Now, is this a spot where you might try sending a query result into a CSV output kind of a thing? You don't have to show that.
Oh, didn't like that. Let me find a CSV. Come on, I know I got some easy CSVs in here. Query 1 results, what is that? I don't know. Yeah, there you go. This is a CSV editor in 6. So I've got a 2-part column here. Or this is a CSV file with 2 columns. And so you can download it, upload it back after changes are made, or add rows.
You can't add columns or take away columns, can you?
You can insert below, you can move up and down, remove, but you cannot add columns, it appears.
Well, that's a feature in my opinion.
Like, yeah, I mean, you should. I mean, it's reasonable to ask to be able to do that. That's for sure.
It is,
but you can control that.
But given that how loose it is, because this then has to be treated essentially as a file input, because the other thing I'm losing here is that you could have typed anything in there, anything from a valid number to a valid date to,
Sure.
Sam was here, right? And then I had to figure out, well, what did you actually give me for that column? And now if I had to guard against columns appearing and disappearing, that makes things even worse because then I don't
Sure.
have an anchor. So I would not want columns to be added rows, yes, but
well, you're in luck because you can't add or remove columns currently. So
so the upside of that is, and in some ways I do see what you're saying though, that could actually be a good fit for what we're doing in that data repeater.
Possibly.
The other angle to that though is that I would also, one of the things I would lose is this data repeater actually does have in the form a form validation flow that asks the question, did you give me a duplicate row?
You could still do that. You could still handle that with a data flow here. There's no technical reason you couldn't get, CSV from file data and handle that in a data flow or a validation flow still.
Well, it seems like the
It'd be
validation
uglier.
flow would get the file data as sort of raw input, and then it would have to kind of work at it from that point of view, no?
You could convert it to, like, you can get let's see, integration, Excel CSV, get CSV. Let's see, what am I looking for? Converts, no. CSV to list, object to CSV, CSV to list. Yeah, that'll take them. That'll take it in, give you a list out, and then you could run your logic against that list.
Right, but I still think, but am I wrong to think that the validation flow would have to begin with the file data?
You're not wrong in that, no. You would have to do that, yes. The input would be file data, yep.
Right.
Alrighty.
And yeah, I mean, that's just kind of
something to explore at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I get, yeah, I mean, I'm honestly surprised I didn't get any feedback over, what's going on there. I mean, I honestly expected to get, hey, this is too slow. Why do we do this? So I could say, well, we didn't have time, and this is the kind of thing you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah,
So
I would have expected that to not really work well at all either. So interesting. So maybe no one's hit the 10,000 case, but.
Well, I know the 10,000 case must exist because there was a want to try and load 20,000 or 30,000.
Sure.
And of course, that did not work just on the file load side. So what they decided to do then is to impose an artificial limit that when we have these kinds of orders, we're going to carve them up by 10,000 so that they basically all behave as separate cases.
Sure.
Even though it's strictly one order. So that's how I know that they're definitely doing that. I just don't know how often or how they manage to. I mean, clearly they're not editing those things. In that way.
Well, God bless the person trying to open that form with 10,000 rows. So, all right. I think looking at time here, let me jump to Carlos's question. What's the way to set a field in a case entity that correctly invokes the file reference structure? When I define the structure of said case entity and try to declare a field defined with file reference structure, an alert appears indicating the structure is compatible with ORM and the information is going to be serialized in binary form. Yeah. So I don't think you actually, Carlos, I wouldn't recommend you make it a part of your structure at all, but let's sort of show what you're showing. So I've got a case entity here. Give this thing a name. Here's a regular property. And then I'm going to add a thing called, attachments or something, right? And then here I'll search for reference. And you're doing file reference. This is the setup that you have on your example, Carlos?
Yes. No, flow reference, no, file reference.
Oh, what is flow reference? Sorry, I picked the wrong thing.
You have to start with file. Yes, the file reference.
There we go. Yeah. So what this means, so the error, what Carlos is asking about is this error down here, which, can I annotate? Hey, I can't annotate, look at that. Is this error down here? And what it's telling us, it says that the file reference property is incompatible with our ORM and will be binary serialized, which is fine. It's a warning. It's not telling you can't do this. But what that means is we don't know, SQL doesn't have a concept of a file reference. So what we do is we turn that into file data. and we save it as like we save the actual like raw byte array, the raw content of the file reference into the database, into that column named, whose name will be attachments in the table name that we will create when we create this. As long as you're going through our service layer, you can access this all day. We will deserialize that blob into a file reference, and you can use that in your flow. But at some point in the future, if you want to like write SQL queries or a point like Tableau or some other reporting tool at your decisions database, that they're not going to be able to make sense of the reference property or the attachment property here, because they won't be able to deserialize that. It'll just be a blob column to them. And so it may not matter for a file reference, but it's not that helpful, or it's just not available if you don't go through our service layer. That's really what this is telling you.
In my case, what I need, I have the file stored in a folder, file references.
Yeah.
And this is information I have, and I want to link that information to a certain case entity that I manipulating. Then how do I link those things together? Because this file belongs to something that is happened in the analysis of the case entity that I am manipulating. How do I reference that?
So I would actually just put the file reference in the case folder itself. That would be my recommendation. Add a file reference entity into the case folder. So if this was like a college application, I would say and I needed to save off the actual application submitted, or like the letter of recommendation or something, whatever a good example here is, I would actually add a file reference entity into the case folder for my letter of recommendation. I wouldn't have a property on my data type called letter of recommendation that was file reference.
But if you need to link this file with many case entities, many different case entities that you use in different cases for different reasons,
then I would just do it by ID. I would just get the ID of that other thing and save it off, not the whole thing itself.
But the ID of the file reference is enough to invoke it?
Yeah, if you have the ID, you can, I mean, I would still use a, sorry, go ahead.
I have the entire file reference. I have the ID, I have the size, everything that the file reference says.
Yeah, then I would save the ID. I would just save off the ID. And then to make it really easy to use, you could use like a data extension, which is a neat thing we can do. So let's assume.
Can you show me that about the data extension, how I declare it?
Yeah. So I'm gonna have this is gonna be called, I'll just call this letter of recommendation, right? And it's gonna be a string. I'll call it letter of recommendation file ID. How do I clear my annotation? Clear. No, erase. There, well, whatever. Okay, and I'm gonna create a thing called letter. This is a case named, new college application, right? And so assume we have the file reference ID when we create this thing. Someone uploads it to a form, we save the ID off. It's just a property on the thing, right? It's just a thing called letter of recommendation. So what I can do, if I want to use this in a flow, what I don't want to do, which is probably what you don't want to do, is I don't want to have to always use a subflow or a step that says, take this ID and take this ID and get, fetch it the actual file. So you can create these virtual properties. They're very clever. If I go to System Designers, look up lists and constants, there's a thing in here called a data extension. And I'm going to say add, or, I'll call this add recommendation letter property to college application case. And this data extension is pretty neat. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to go to the start step, and I'm going to tell it what the type of the thing is. So I'll name this thing, I'll just name it current case. and I'll find in here my thing, the type I just created, which is new college application. And then what I could do here is, I think, get list file by path. I don't actually know how to load a file reference by its ID off the top of my head. Get file references in folder, load file from data. Let me just see, I got a couple minutes here. Integration, internal services, file reference service, get file data. Does this just take this takes file name, get file takes ID. So this, let's see if we can get this to, let me come back to that. Let's see. And then I'm going to have, this thing is going to be called, I'm going to create an output here called recommendation letter. And I'm going to make this type file data. And then I'm just going to set this to be constant for now. And possibly, if we have time, circle back to fetching it. I'm just going to select any file here. This will be my major OS versions file here. Now, you should assume for purposes of this example, I'm fetching the file here in this flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you'll see is if I come back, I save this, and again, I'm in lookup list, and I created a data extension. I'm going to come back into my flow here. And I'm going to create a new flow, right? And I'm going to put on the start step, I'm going to put a piece of that college application on this in current application. I'll search for college. And here's my college application. And if I look at Data Explorer, you'll see if I open up current application, I have a bunch of things that should look familiar to you, but I also have a property here called recommendation letter. And so this now shows up wherever the new college application property shows up. And whenever I access this property, it runs that flow and returns me that result when I need it. And so this way I can sort of abstract out the data object from the access. So if I know I'm going to be accessing the recommendation letter in this example often, I can create this data extension and then have a more abstract but easier data model without incurring the cost of doing lots of extra mapping when I'm building a flow. Does this make sense, Al?
I think so. I have to try it. I think it's.
And I do think, at least I hope so. I hope we have documents about this data extension. Data extensions. Yeah, we do have a doc for data extensions. This is in data structures, data extensions. Yeah. Data extensions are used to add fields to data structure. So, and there is a doc for this that walks you through. I think we use like a full name example or something for an account for this example. But the principle's the same. So I would save the ID. If you need to save the ID of the related file, I would save its ID in the data object, and then fetch the actual file in a data extension. That'd be my recommendation here. All right, a couple minutes left. Alex, I may have misunderstood Will's answer to Carlos's question, but if decision saves the actual file contents in the serialized field, won't that defeat the purpose of using a reference instead of just using the file content? It also does, yes, there is that consequence as well as that. You've got a reference now on the file system and also on the data type, and you don't need both. So it does sort of defeat the purpose of using a file reference a bit there. So I'd either, again, to sort of loop back all the way, I would use a file reference entity, and I would put that in the case folder. But Carlos's example doesn't fit that requirement because he has one file that may be attached to many different cases. And then he doesn't want to copy that file into the folder, in which case I would save the ID of that thing. And there's two ways to do this. I could create an entity, a custom entity that I deposit in the folder called related document, and I could save its ID there, or I could have a property on the data type itself where I save the ID. Now, if we have a list of IDs, we're back into the serialized piece, where it's going to, because a string list will be serialized into the database in the same way the file reference is per that previous error message. And so we, with that same inability to access it via SQL will exist if we use a string list property, but we could get around that by having create an entity and then deposit an entity in that folder to be the sort of one-to-many document to cases relationship. Go ahead, Alex.
No, the other thing could be if it is a segregated entity, and I'm using the word entity as I imagine a table in the SQL database.
Yes.
And then keep in your list just the ID to that SQL table. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly right.
You bypass the decisions logic and you go back to a more traditional way of modeling, right? But there might be some pros and cons of doing either.
Yeah, I mean the cons are that you would create more mapping, like because every time you access that, you probably need to do work, but that data extension can mediate that con by letting you only do the access flow one time, and then you just use that property like we were showing. So there are some downsides to that approach. Yes, that is true, but the data extensions are meant to account for that, or at least that's one of the things they can help with. Might be a better way to say that.
Sorry, and we have 3 minutes. I'm not sure whether I can ask a question I posted earlier. You were showing reports, and one of the things that you can do when you have the report is to group by a certain field, right? Group a certain field. I noticed that when you do that, the column with that field doesn't go away in the presentation. Is there any way to make it go away? Because you're grouping by, say, field X, but also there is a column saying field X showing, its value repeated time and again, right?
You can make columns invisible, which would be the first way I would do that. So if I was grouping by authentication type here, so your concern is I have Active Directory here, but I also show Active Directory here.
Correct.
I would go to authentication type and set it to not be visible. It's still a part of the report, but not visible. That's be the first way I would do that. Is your question, can I hide the group itself?
Well, what I was hoping is that when I group by whatever is the variable that you chose, Active Directory, for example, or password, that the column Active Directory and password would, sorry, no, this is, what is the column that, sorry,
Yeah, we're grouping on authentication type here.
Authentication type, sorry, that the column authentication type would disappear and would not be shown.
It doesn't happen by default, but you can make it. And all you have to do is select it and make it set visible to false, and it'll disappear from the view.
And that works, when I am the one who configures, but users also have the capability.
Sure.
To do this.
I see what you're saying. It doesn't currently handle that at runtime chart or runtime report modification or whatever. Yeah, you can't. You have to do that at design time only currently.
That would be an enhancement request. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Alrighty. Will I have to jump to another meeting? So thank you very much.
Oh, me as well. Thanks everyone. I appreciate the content. Sabrina, who's here tomorrow? I'm not sure. It's not me.
It would be Corey Anderson and Brandon Pierce.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the questions.
Bye.